Why? This was all a picture of the antithesis, a picture that Israel was to be different and separate from all the other nations around them. And this was shown in all of these laws, which to us appear to be strange. Now, these laws have been abrogated, no longer apply to us in the New Testament, but the spirit of the law remains. We are to be spiritually different from the world. Part of this separation from the world that Israel was to observe was to be different in their worship practices. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 12 a warning to Israel when they were to enter the promised land. At the very end of that chapter, chapter 12, we read verse 30 and onwards, "Take heed to thyself that thou be not snared by following them," that is, the people who used to live in Israel, "after that they be destroyed from before thee, and that thou inquire not after their gods, saying, How did these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise." And so Israel was not to ask the question, well, how did the Canaanites serve their gods? Perhaps they have some wonderful insights into the worship of God, which we could use to worship our God. And we are not today in the New Testament church to ask the question, well, how does the Roman Catholic Church worship their God? Perhaps we can pick up some tips from the charismatics on how to worship our God, or from the mega churches. They seem to have all kinds of lively worship. But that is not to be our attitude. We are to separate ourselves from all kinds of ungodly worship. We are to worship God exactly as He has commanded in His Word. And one kind of worship in our text, which was strictly forbidden, was the worship of Molech, the god of the Ammonites. The Ammonites descended from Ammon, and Ammon was conceived by Lot in an incestuous relationship with his daughter, just within sight of the smoking ruins of Sodom. And the Ammonites were a reprobate people descended from those wicked people outside of Sodom. They were then the false church. Ammon is a picture in the Old Testament of the false church. And Moses says here, do not worship the gods of the false church. Do not try and copy their worship practices, because their worship practices are an abomination unto Jehovah. Let's consider then this particular sin of worshipping Molech. The sin of giving our seed to Molech. We will see, first of all, it's an abominable sin. Then it's a covenantal sin, that is, a sin against the covenant. And thirdly, it is an intolerable sin. This is an abominable sin. It's abominable because of the actual practice involved in the worship of Molech. This practice is so abominable that it makes one shudder even to describe it. Molech was a grotesque and bloodthirsty monster, and he demanded a certain kind of sacrifice, and that sacrifice was the sacrifice of little children. Molech was a bronze statue with the head of an ox, and he had arms stretched forth before him. He was made of solid brass, and the way he was worshipped was this. The priests would light a fire within the statue of Molech until Molech became red hot. And then upon those red hot arms, his worshippers would bring little children. And they would lay those little children upon the red hot arms of Molech. And those little children would die in horrible agony as they were burned alive to Molech. And often in the Old Testament you read of passing your children through the fire to Molech. That is the kind of practice which was being described there. And so, you would hear in the valley where Molech was worshipped, screams of children being burned alive. And in order to drown out those screams, the priests of Molech would beat a drum loudly so that no one could hear the screams of those little children. That was the abominable practice of the worship of Molech. And you must ask yourselves, who could be so wicked and so depraved and so cruel as to sacrifice little children to a god in such a manner? But think of this. This could be the rationale of the worshipper of Molech. When you worship your God, do you not bring to him your most precious possession? And we the Molech worshippers, we bring our God our most precious possession, our little children. And we suppress our natural parental ideas and attitudes, and we give our children to Molech, even though it hurts us, even though it's difficult for us to stand it. This shows that we are particularly devoted to our God Molech. But you Israelites, you just bring bulls and sheep, and your worship is cold in comparison to our worship, which is so vibrant and devout. That could be the rationale of the worshipper of Molech, and that's the kind of argument you hear from the false church today. Our worship is much more vibrant and lively than yours is. Yours is cold and boring. But in a way, the Molech worshipper was right. It is true worship to bring to God your most precious possession, that gift which costs you the most. But you do not bring your children to God in the way that the Molech worshipper brought his children to God. God does not demand our children to be sacrificed in a horrible ritual like this so that they die in horrible agony. But God does demand that we give him our children. And we do. And it is costly. Think of what must be sacrificed by godly parents in order to give their children to the Lord. Money. Much money goes into the upbringing of children. And time and energy. All of this is expended so that the children can be brought up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And when those children grow up, they realize the cost that their parents made in order to bring them in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And those children begin to see the cost for themselves, as they have to live differently from their peers, as they have to carry their cross as children of the church, and as they have to suffer the persecution and the ridicule of those around them. It's costly for us to bring our children to God. But God does not demand their blood the way the Molech worshippers worshipped their God. And you might think that this would never have happened in the history of Israel, that Israel would ever have worshipped Molech. After all, we have here an express prohibition, and other places as well. It never entered into God's mind, never, that his people would worship this grotesque God. But sadly, the history of Israel, the history of the Old Testament church, has examples of Molech being worshipped. Even King Solomon was guilty of this. 1 Kings 11 tells us that Solomon married many strange wives, and among those strange wives were women who worshipped Molech, or gods like him. 1 Kings 11 verse 5, for Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, which is another name for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. And verse 7, then did Solomon build an high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon.